days. But then at some point, the Germans began to do this for themselves, and then they began to move into Latin America, and much of the industrialization of the southern part of Brazil is in fact by Germans, not by Portuguese. And much of the industrialization of Russia was by people who were not Russian. They were Germans, they were English, they were Jews, they were all sorts of other groups, almost anything other than Russian. Japan is another example where once they were exposed to the Western technology, they seized upon it and then sort of took the ball and ran with it themselves. There are other cases where the stuff comes in and it sits there and the people around them don't seize upon it. And again, these are areas where I would like to know the answers, but at this point, I'm happy just to be able to ask the questions because those questions have been ignored so much.
Which is why you question the kind of lazy formulation of foreign aid, right?
Oh, yes. That there you're simply transferring the wealth that has already been created, but you're not transferring the ability to create that wealth.
What about if you transfer expertise?
Oh, that's easier said than done as well. But I think that the expertise, if there is a fertile soil for it, of course that can happen. Too often in foreign aid, you're rewarding people for doing all the wrong things. That is, you're willing to lavish foreign aid on Tanzania because they have bungled so many things and people are on the edge of starvation. You are not willing to send foreign aid to the Ivory Coast because they've done things that worked out. And so you're subsidizing irresponsibility. But I've discovered the very same thing a decade ago in looking at programs for minority students in the United States. It's a certain mindset that you see in every area, that you want to give help to those who need it most. And often what that means is not someone who was more disadvantaged at the outset, but someone who was more irresponsible in dealing with a situation.
So that on the whole, if you're looking for productivity, you would tend to concentrate on those nations or those individuals who were closest to making it already.
Yes.
And needed just that little marginal help.
Yes. But the other thing that happens too with foreign aid is that you subsidize counterproductive policies. It becomes easier then for people to oppress those minorities in their countries who have the entrepreneurship. And even in very poor countries, there are often groups who do have this entrepreneurship, either part of the majority of the society or particular groups like the Chinese, the East Indians in East Africa, the Igbos in Nigeria, the Lebanese in a number of countries. And what the political leaders can do is repress and in some cases engage in mass expulsions of those people who have all the skills that are needed in the country. And then foreign aid will come in and rescue them from the consequences of having done that.
As in Uganda, for instance.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what would have been sensible there would presumably have been to have backed a government that would welcome back those Indians.
Oh, yes. The boat people are a classic example that most of the boat people were Chinese. And the reason they couldn't find a home was precisely because they were Chinese and were so hated. You see, I mentioned earlier that the skills tend to flow to where they're scarce. But what that means is that there'll be a greater differential between the majority of the people and those who have these scarce skills. And therefore, those people who are most needed will be most hated.
Most hated?
Yes.
Yeah. Ms. Sowell, our examiner is well known to regular viewers of this program. He is as distinguished as a left-wing economist can hope to become. Professor Robert de Cashman teaches at Lehman College. He is at the University of New York. He is the author of a number of books, including Greed is Not Enough. Presumably we need greed and a strong defense, right, Bob? Mr. de Cashman.
I will treat the subject earnestly, Mr. Buckley. Dr. Sowell, we are, it is true, both economists, horrid creatures, as John Maynard Keynes called us, but necessary for a while. What I'd like to explore at the beginning with you is the relationship between markets and politics. I was struck in reading your book with a very, very strong view that you take that politics broadly are ineffective in altering the condition of any given group, and markets are very powerful.
No, I would have to disagree with that. Politics are very ineffective in improving the position of any groups. Politics can be quite counterproductive for all sorts of groups.
Let me accept your correction. Take two groups who have indeed been successful for long periods, both of whom you cite, Jews and overseas Chinese. Now, as I read your account of their success, it struck me that what they were lacking was effective politics frequently. The overseas Chinese, time and time again, have been expelled, persecuted, just because they were so successful, which to my mind translates into the proposition that because they didn't organize themselves politically, they were exceptionally vulnerable to the envy and the hostility and the demagoguery, if you like, of the politicians in the assorted countries. And we're talking about the Jews going back to the 15th century and earlier in Spain, who, because they were powerless politically, precisely, were unable to preserve the economic advantages which they had gained.
Or Germany.
Or what?
Or Germany would be an example.
Or Germany, certainly, yes.
Well, as I think of that, the problem is finding examples, because the groups that have succeeded as spectacularly as the Jews and the Chinese have done so staying away from politics. And so I'd have to find the counterexample. The counterexample I can think of would be the Chinese after the rise of Chinese nationalism in the early 20th century under Sun Yat-sen, where they exported this to Southeast Asia, where this Chinese nationalism was taught in the schools, where Chinese who had thought of themselves for generations as Thais and Burmese and so forth now began to think of themselves as Chinese, even though they lived in Burma or Thailand or whatnot. And it's precisely the rise of this that rekindles the hatred against the Chinese in Southeast Asia, which then culminates in the tragedy of the boat people. So that when the Chinese belatedly were dragged into politics, in this case provoked from overseas, it blew up in their face. Something very similar happened with Germans in Brazil. Again, Germans being very apolitical. In the First World War and before, the Kaiser's government tried to make political capital out of them. They began to publish things in Brazil, promoting the Germans and so on. That also blew up in their face and led to mob riots directed against German businesses and German residential neighborhoods. So I can't believe that that more of the same would have been better.
But you know, it leaves one in a very gloomy mood, does it not? Because it does suggest that however hardworking, culturally advantaged, in the sense that you've been using the term, a group happens to be, in a way, the more successful it is, the more vulnerable it becomes to severe political reprisals. I don't know exactly what the political solution is, but it does strike me that politics is unavoidable, really, if a group desires not merely to advance, as you suggest, the Irish in the 19th century in this country used politics to advance their situation, but even to preserve the advantages which market behavior.
Well, the Chinese haven't had to do that in America, have they?
They have not. But let me, in fact, go to a corollary of this, again on the Jewish bit. Jews have done well in this country, but they have done well within the confines, actually, of the politics and the customs of the country. It was very difficult prior to the Second World War for a Jew to become a professor of English.
Yes.
Lionel Trilling was an instructor practically for eternity at Columbia College before he was promoted. Very difficult until very recently for Jews to become doctors. Now, they did become successful in alternative ways, but in fact, the markets distorted the use of human capital that would have occurred in the presence of better political arrangements, which leads me to, finally, a point I wanted to get to on affirmative action. Nothing has separated the Jewish and the black community more in the last generation than this issue of affirmative action, which for critical Jews invariably is termed quotas rather than affirmative action.
Well, they're different.
What?
They are different.
They are different. Let me, in fact, suggest this as a hypothesis. I'd be interested in your comment. Has there not been, throughout our history, a whole set of formal, informal, affirmative actions for white males, for Episcopalians, for graduates of Ivy League colleges, pardoning your presence, Mr. Buckley, has there not, in fact,
Why not him?
in clubs, I suppose, I'm not sure whether I should include myself. I went to Columbia.
Oh, yes.
What about clubs like the Century Association in this city, the Bohemian Grove, the Duquesne Club, the various clubs which are engaged in affirmative action for limited groups of their own members? In all of these clubs, important business is transacted to the benefit of the members and to the exclusion of people who are not.
It doesn't
We've
follow.
had affirmative action of all kinds in this country addressed to the interest of the stronger groups. Now, comes a moment in our history when affirmative action, for a bit, is advanced for the benefit of groups which have been traditionally at the short end of the distribution of good things in our society. And there is considerable revulsion against it. Isn't this just a bit of historical justice that's being established?
I'm afraid I simply do not see the justice in making people who are badly off worse off in the name of advancing them.
Why do you say it makes them worse off?
The figures I just cited, and I could go on if there were a lot.
Now wait, that
many more.
interested me. On page 131, I think, in fact, I'm quite sure, I just looked it up. On page 131, you contrast, as you did in your earlier conversation with Mr. Buckley, you contrast the black experience in the 1960s and the 1970s. Well, now, if I were to interpret the difference, I'd be inclined to point to certain phenomena, notably the oil shock in 1973, the second oil shock in 1979, the sharp recession in 74, 75, another recession in 79, 80. And in fact, what this suggests to me is that the gains of affirmative action are extraordinarily precarious if you run an economy at low levels of activity. That, of course, affirmative action isn't enough by itself. It would be foolish for anybody, even on my side of the issue, to argue that. But I would suggest to you that it's a bad comparison, because the 60s were a period of expansion with or without affirmative action, given the presence of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, given the 1954 Brown decision, and the general climate of opinion, opportunities for minority communities and a majority community, women.
Question, Mr. Cashman?
What?
Question, please.
Well, yes, I will come to a question. It's always possible to put speeches into question form. In fact, do you really think, these considerations taken into mind, that the 70s disproved the efficacy of affirmative action?
I think that when one makes a profound change in a society, arousing enormous passions across the board, that the burden of proof should be on those who think that this is beneficial. Because I have been listening very carefully, and you have yet to hear the benefit to disadvantaged blacks that has been empirically discovered after affirmative action.
Well, how quickly do you expect the changes? You know, we're impatient as a people. In fact, as I understand one of your...
We've had dramatic changes in the other direction, Mr. Cashman. For instance,
Oh,
the
but
number-
I
the-
attribute them
the-
to other causes, you say.
sex.
I attribute the effects to other causes, largely to the economic disorders of the